Africans and Europeans, Part 1. Now, when we're talking about Africans in the Americas, what we're really talking about is slavery. But before we can talk about slavery, we have to think about what exactly is slavery. How do we define slavery? So I want you to take a second and maybe jot down a couple of notes. What is slavery? How do you define slavery? Now, generally, slavery is defined as the state of being a slave, which is, so helpful. But a slave is considered the legal property of another and forced to obey them. So keeping that definition in mind, let's look at who are the exact first slaves in what comes to be the United States. The first slaves in what came to be the continental United States were actually part of a Spanish group that established the colony of San Miguel de Guadalupe. This was most likely in northern Georgia or southern South Carolina, and it was established in 1526. The thing is, it only lasted for a few months due to numerous problems. Now, how many slaves exactly were included in this group of about 600 colonists is actually unknown. However, we do know that during this time period, there was some sort of slave uprising in the colony, and some slaves set fire actually to a home. But no details of this uprising are known beyond that, besides that the slaves, and I quote, had reason for the actions that they took and that the mutineers were then arrested. That's it. Even the consequences these slaves faced are unknown, though it seems that some may have run away into the woods, but whether they survived or had any positive or negative interactions, especially amongst Native Americans, is unknown. Those who then left the colony wrote nothing about the enslaved Africans. Did they leave them there? Did they take them with them? We really don't know. We can also go to the next incident that there might have been slaves at, which is perhaps there were slaves in the first attempt at the colony of Roanoke back in 1586. They would have been brought there by English privateer Francis Drake. However, we know that he had captured some slaves from Caribbean islands before coming to Roanoke, but the fate of the slaves remains a mystery because there's basically no documentation of what happened to them when the colony was abandoned. Were they, once again, did they take them with them? Did they leave them there? We don't know. The fact that so much of these enslaved Africans' fate is unknown is actually what reveals the most to us about the English and Spanish colonists of the 1500s. That basically the Africans' fate did not truly matter to them, and that in their mind there was other issues that were just more noteworthy, even when dealing with the aftermath of a slave rebellion. Simply put, detailed documentation of what happened to the African slaves was basically just unimportant to these colonists, and therefore we can get from this that African slaves on some level were unimportant. They weren't noteworthy. Generally speaking, though, most historians, when talking about African slavery in North America, tend to start actually with 1619 at the Virginia colony, when some, and I quote, Negroes arrived and were sold to labor-hungry Virginians. But even here, we do not have specific documentation of the status of these odd Africans. But let's rewind to what we do know about these particular Africans. We know that these Africans arrived in Virginia in about 1619, and they had been taken from Angola, where they were probably captured after a series of wars there and then forced to march to the coast, where they would have been put aboard a ship to cross the Atlantic. Now, this journey across the Atlantic would have been known as the Middle Passage. Quick note about the Middle Passage, it would have lasted about 6 to 8 weeks. African slaves would have been forced to remain below deck most of the time, except for having brief excursions above deck for forced exercise and the like. They would have been forced into cramped quarters, as you can see in these pictures. This means that the air below deck would have been putrid with, vomit, blood, excrement. Oftentimes there was rebellions in the form of African slaves might try to commit suicide by like starvation or jumping off the ship. You do get the occasional full-on rebellion, but generally these were unsuccessful. In the Middle Passage, anywhere between 5 to 20% of those aboard would die of disease. And those who do survive would then have to endure like the fear and humiliation of being like sold, public auctions, being poked and prodded, looked at for signs of disease. And so before I go into the particular Africans we were looking at that made it to Virginia's colony, I have to give you some just quick numbers. If we look at the number of Africans that crossed the Atlantic before 1600, it is about 350,000. Whereas then in the 17th century, so in the 1600s, it's 1.8 million. And then in the 18th century, or the 1700s, it is 6.1 million. So you're seeing a huge increase in this African slave trade. The thing is, virtually all Africans arriving are going to come to the Americas as slaves, and they're going to perform a lot of the labor of colonization. Only about 1 out of 20 of these African slaves are going to come actually to the British mainland colonies. Most are going to go to like Brazil, the West Indies, or New Spain. The thing is, before the Spanish, the English, the French, all enslaved Africans, really they attempted first to enslave Native Americans, but Native Americans really couldn't fulfill their labor needs, partly due to disease and the harsh working conditions, but also like Indians could more easily escape and go home to a certain extent, whereas that's going to be a lot more difficult for an African slave. And so really by 1700, the Indian slave trade is going to be largely supplemented by the larger traffic of Africans. So jumping back to the particular Africans that made it to Virginia's colony, they were actually aboard a ship that was attacked by 2 English privateers who then went on to sail to Virginia and sold them here to wealthy English planters. But here's where things become complicated. Were these Africans slaves, or were they actually more along the lines of indentured servants? To understand exactly what they were, we have to understand what an indentured servant was. So this is jumping back to that. Indentured servants were basically the dominant labor force of the English colonies during much of the 1600s. To be an indentured servant, you signed one's labor to an individual within a contract. A lot of times this was for a specific time period. A lot of times it was like 5 to 7 years, and for passage to America in return. Indentured servants were not technically property, but their labor was seen as property in a sense, and their labor therefore could be sold from one owner to another. Furthermore, over time, a lot of those who owned indentured servants would come to see them as if they were their property, and oftentimes force them to do back-breaking labor, and these indentured servants had very limited rights. In fact, most of the time, judges would rule in favor of a master rather than an indentured servant when it came to their rights, and even punishments that might result in an indentured servant's death. The thing is, this view of indentured servants and the change in this view actually helps ease the way for colonies like Virginia to accept slavery being its eventual dominant system. However, there was more to it than that, as while in the early 1600s, indentured servants were readily available and familiar, by the time we get to like 1680, indentured servants are a lot harder to find, partly due to we have an improving economy in England, making less people choose to immigrate to the colonies. And then on top of that, we have like Bacon's Rebellion that we just looked at that was compromised of a lot of indentured servants also, which helped push Virginia towards a system of slavery. But going back to where we were, what of these first Africans that landed in Virginia in 1619? Are they indentured servants or are they slaves? While on one hand, they had not signed labor contracts in leaving Africa, and then they had gone on to endure the Middle Passage and then been sold, the only documentation we have of them refers to them being called Negroes, not slaves. Furthermore, at that time, there were no laws in Virginia actually concerning slaves, so it's questionable, could we even have slavery if we didn't have laws protecting slavery on some level? Once again, we see this lack of complete documentation. Now, what we do know about these early Africans who came to the English colonies, while enduring much of the hardships, they're still going to live in this atmosphere of racial tolerance that is really unthinkable by the 18th century. And a great example of this is going to be Anthony Johnson, which we will start with on the next PowerPoint.